I guess it's year 20 to 28, there's a 7.5 million funding gap. I know that you have 4.1 million in reserve. Where do you expect to, just so the board is well aware of, where do you expect that money to come from for that?
Great. The RDA has a matching agreement with the city. The RDA could utilize a portion of the city's tax increment, and the RDA would match it. And so the idea is that, well, we don't need that now. When that gap comes in and is identified, then we would ask for the city to contribute. I believe it's about $500,000, and the RDA would match $500,000 for that.
Roughly $1 million a year.
Yes, and so so the purpose is not to use that money or to go into the city's general fund until we need that. And Justin put together that great spreadsheet, and we had a chance to meet with Jennifer and Ben to go over it. So that would be it, and then so that would help fill that gap in addition when, based on projections, we believe we'll need that. So we do have a source to fill that remaining about $3 million during those gap years in addition to it. And so we're hoping that we don't have to utilize it until that point. But we're comfortable with the $5 million reserve up until, depending on how projections go.
So it would just be a match from the city then for the tax increment?
Mm-hmm, correct. So
that's not standard. Is this the first time that we've looked at doing something like that?
I think I wasn't as familiar. I think there were a lot of different mechanisms deployed for helping pay the debt service on Eccles Theater, and this one was identified, and I call it more the option B. It was meant to say, I think the intent initially when they put this together was to have other funding sources if there is a deficit and being able to pay the debt service, and this is one of them that was negotiated as part of the overall agreements amongst the RDA and the other taxing entities.
I'm going to invite Jennifer Bruno up
Jennifer
to talk about this because she's been very involved in this.
Yeah, it's a long history. The gap is assuming that match is in place, and so it's in addition to that match. And so I think that's why the debt service reserve is important, because that's the funding source for the gap, not necessarily the city match. I think if Block 70 increments come in much better than projected, which by all accounts they very well could, based on the development that's occurring there, that gap could be smaller and smaller and smaller each year. And so, the level of that debt service reserve probably doesn't need to be that 7.5 million, but it might need to be 5 or 6. And so I think that's, to Ed's point about Justin's magic spreadsheet, I think that's the point where each year we'll kind of watch the tax increment as it comes in and try to figure out what that ideal level is. But clearly it shows that you need to put away money in good years because you're going to need it later, in addition to what the city's already pledged. So,
and just to reiterate that's why in Block 70 we're committing most of the tax increment these next couple of years towards that reserve before we do need to tap into the city's matching portion. And we hope after we've met that gap, then we might have tax increment available on Block 70 to do other great art projects. But probably for the initial years, to be more conservative, we're recommending that all of the tax increment go towards that debt service reserve.
Thank you. Hey, that was impressively fast. Thank you very much. And now we'd like to invite up Jennifer Bruno and Ben Ludke. And is John joining you or not? Okay.
anyone can join.
All right, thank you. And these are our crack budget analysts in the council office, and they are going to go over a few things with us. Thank you so much.
So rather than kind of go through a lot of the things that the RDA staff and economic development went through very well, we'll maybe focus on this more like we do with general fund budget departments, where we focus on sort of key policy issues. Sometimes that relates to specific projects, but most of the time it relates to sort of general budgeting policy and making sure that we have a sound foundation for that general budgeting policy before we then go and talk about projects. So you'll recall that in the general fund concept, you approve an operating budget, and then you actually approve your capital budget, sort of separately, where you talk about specific projects and the merits of the projects and you weigh them. So if we want to start on page 2 of the staff report, the bottom of page 2, and then we can just kind of go through some of the major policy topics. The first is the administrative budget, and this is the first, because this is the first year we're sort of doing the RDA budget this way and analyzing it with our staff. We've done maybe what you call a basic review of the administrative budget, as opposed to the deep dive that we tend to do on other administrative budgets in the rest of the city. So for other administrative budgets, we would go through and pull things like how much was actually spent on consultants, to your question earlier, how much was actually spent on travel, and then trying to set the annual budget to more closely relate to what was actually spent, obviously trying to ensure that it relates to council priorities. So one of the things that we've noted is that the sources for the administrative budget vary based on the funds, each project area's ability to pay for the administrative budget, which has pros and cons. I think it enables project areas that maybe don't generate as much increment to receive a lot of staff work and staff attention without necessarily having to pay for all of it. But it also means that your burden on, for example, the program income fund or even the central business district is a little bit higher, because that allows that essentially pays for the staff time to be spent on others. And if you go to the page 4, the chart on page 4 shows you how the administration.
And can I back you up just
Yeah.
for a second? This is a really great report. It's really clear. It's easy to understand. I feel like this is my 4th time seeing stuff like this, but I understand it better, maybe because it's so clear, not because it's the 4th time. But Block 70 does not allow for administration collection. Was that part of our deal with the county and
Right.
how that was set up?
Right,
Okay.
and that's fairly typical, that it's part of the negotiation process, at least fairly typical in the ones that I've witnessed. Maybe it was done a different way before, but it seems that that's always part of the negotiation with taxing entities, because of course taxing entities are wary of their dollars kind of being, put into what they consider a black hole, even though we know that the staff is probably the most important part of the budget. But that they want to have some sort of control over how their, what they consider their tax increment is spent. And so it's pretty common, actually, especially in other communities, for that administrative budget to be pretty limited.
Cindy Guest Jensen?
Just, it is, though, a policy issue for the council to consider. You could set a framework, so to speak, that you follow cost allocation in the RDA project areas, just as you do with city, with the enterprise funds and things like that, so that you are more directly charging these areas. So where it's been negotiated already, that's not an issue, but in the in going forward, yeah.
Madam Chair, I don't know if everyone's prepared to have that discussion today, but I am interested in having it, and I am not today with the beginning of the discussion, and that we haven't had it yet. I am not interested in more tightly aligning expenditures of staff time to revenue from a project area. I think that it is self-perpetuating in many ways, that we have a central business district that will hopefully continue to be a profitable project area for the RDA. And I think that the reason we take on project areas is in part because we want to spur economic development, and we get to use the resources from other successful areas to get that development off the ground. But I do want to have a broader conversation and understand more of the reasons to consider such a policy shift. But as of now, that's where I'm at.
Just, there might be 2 parts to that, going along with Board Member Mendenhall. There's the issue of whether you allocate those costs internally. You could choose not to do that in that way that I just described, but you could still choose to have a policy in how you negotiate with the taxing entities so that they are contributing funds. It is part of that overall.
I see what you're saying.
But
and that's a different
yeah,
ball
so
of
I hadn't
yarn.
thought of that before, but.
Thank you.
Great. Go ahead, Jennifer.
So the chart on page 4 shows the breakout of the $3 million budget, which is essentially salaries and benefits, and then the amount that's going to the percent, or the amount that's going to personal services, which is things like administrative fees, which is actually the reimbursement that the RDA gives to other general fund departments or internal service fund departments for service that is provided to the RDA. And we'll have a number of follow-up questions just to make sure that we understand how the operating and maintenance budget or other personal services budget relates to other things that might seem administrative that are in the project areas, like you flagged the $250,000 for professional services in program income fund. And so I think just getting a sense of where one falls in one category versus the other category, just so that we have a clear understanding of that. Right now, there's not really a policy governing where something should be funded out of. There's many times where studies and due diligence and things like that are funded out of the project area itself and are approved specifically for a project or for a specific development. And then there are other times where it's sort of floated by the administrative budget. So there's also a kind of funky thing that happens with just the way the RDA funds are distributed by the county, which is that this budget is set in May of this year, and funds aren't actually distributed by the county until March, April of the following year. And so most of the time with capital projects, you can sort of adjust, and most of the time we've been lucky and revenues are usually higher than the budget. But it caused us to think this year, when the depot district came in a little bit lower than the budgeted revenue, that in the extreme case, if you had lots of property depreciation in, say, somewhere like the central business district, which is a crucial part of the administrative budget, you've already committed to funding the staffing costs. That's a fixed cost that you can't necessarily adjust downward that late in the fiscal year. So not to say that that would likely happen, or especially in that magnitude, but just flagging it as an issue kind of to watch going forward, and we'll keep working with finance and the administration to try and sort of write that planning. Maybe it's even a contingency fund that's part of it. The next sort of big policy item is housing, and while this budget doesn't necessarily propose how to spend the affordable housing funds that were set aside by the board earlier the year, just wanted to highlight for you guys that it's still sitting there, and that the council staff and the administrative staff are working together to put together sort of a proposal that's based on the GROW SLC policy objectives that I believe the council's been talking about. So that's ongoing. We'll come back with more information on that. The one other piece of this budget that was interesting is...
rudely interrupt for just a minute? Board members, if you have any questions you want to ask as Jennifer and Ben are going through this, go ahead to jump in. We're doing so well with time that like we could go for brunch or something in between. But this is your opportunity if you have some questions. So go ahead. Sorry to interrupt you, Jennifer.
Another sort of policy item to note in the budget is the concept of the citywide housing fund versus the project area housing fund. In the past, the RDA has provided funds from different project areas and transferred those funds into each of those funds, the citywide housing fund and the project area housing fund. I think based on the feedback from the board and council that the council and board are interested in spreading housing across the city. The staff rightly noticed that the citywide housing funds are much more flexible in terms of where they can be spent. They don't have to be spent in a project area. They just have to have a 80% AMI or below kind of threshold. So this budget really shifts all of the RDA's funds, those regular funds that go into housing, away from the project area housing fund and into the citywide housing fund. So from a staff perspective, it seems consistent with everything you guys have said, but we just wanted to note it for you so that you weren't surprised when you thought maybe there was a secret project area housing fund that no one was telling you about.
And so. I'm going to make a mental note to always ask that, which is it, so that going forward I'm always identifying which it is, so we know that distinction. Thanks for making that for us.
And actually, one of the other things to note is that, again, not all of the project areas contribute to that housing fund, and not all of the project areas contribute equally to the housing fund. They kind of contribute on the basis of the taxing entity agreement. So whatever was negotiated with the taxing entity at the time, as well as whatever the state law was at the time that the project area was created, which it's changed a couple of times. So,
Madam Chair, I really like the second point you have there before the revenue sources little graph about tracking the benefits of the housing investments that we make throughout the city. And I'm curious about your ideas, and I know Hand surely has ideas, and we continue to have those housing discussions with them. But about tracking that, and with regard, just with the 9th South off-ramp utilization study I just mentioned, that we make it, let's say we make a bunch of housing investments, as have already happened and are going to continue to happen in the central 9th area. And I wonder if there are ways that we can mine for data from people moving into these project areas about whether or not they even work in the city, what kind of transportation they're using, which might be better information than just whether or not the parking units that are built into the project are utilized or not. But I think that there is a lot of information we can get there about whether or not just what their vacancy rates are, but really who are the people that are moving in, and what kind of economic information can we get that can be a better lens for us to see whether or not we're really succeeding at our project area goals. That vibrancy, are they shopping in the area? Are they having to leave the area to access the kind of services that they need? Where are they going if they're doing that? How are they getting there? And I'm just pulling these out of thin air. I'm sure that Hand and Economic Development and you guys could come up with better questions to help us figure out if these housing investments are meeting the goals that we think they are, if there's parity here. So
Okay, we'll make a note
perhaps
of
it's
that.
rhetorical at this point. I think it's,
Well, and I think it's worth sharing, also sharing with the council. Recognize the irony in that. As the council continues the council's discussion on housing, because I think it relates to city investment in housing as well as RDA investment in housing. So maybe maybe it could be incorporated into the housing plan in terms of tracking success of that plan.
yeah. And I wonder if our biannual citizen survey is a way that we could access some of this information through a tool we already use, But I really want to, we're making a major commitment to housing above and beyond what we have previously as an RDA. And it would be very important for us to see what the results are of these investments as we go ahead. So do I need to make a formal request?
I think I don't know.
Sometimes that helps us so that then we know and the administration knows if that's a request that the full council supports.
Shall I phrase it as a straw poll, or how do you want that?
Maybe if it's okay with the chair, you
Yeah.
could do a quick straw poll. I should have said board, not council, sorry.
It's okay. We understand who you mean. Do you want to state that in?
Yeah, let me
Which way
see.
you'd like it to be a straw poll?
With regard to our significant affordable housing investments as an RDA, and in collaboration with Housing Neighborhood Development, I would like RDA staff to work with the administration those that oversee the biannual citizen survey to find ways to gather data on the housing investments we make as we go forward to help inform the goals that we intend for those
Can
investments.
I add measure impact?
Yes, thank you, please.
Are we clear on that? Okay, those in favor of giving that recommendation to the RDA, thumbs up. That is unanimous. Thank you very much. Thanks for proposing that.
Madam Chair,
Yes.
going back to the policy question about citywide versus project area housing, I think that we have some tacit agreement about we want to spread housing across, but we haven't gotten into that very deeply. And I'm very interested in talking more about that because by default, by going to the citywide, we may drift in these project areas. And I see the potential argument here that having it across the city helps air quality and housing in general, so it helps the whole city, but it still may not help individual project areas that need very specific targeted investment that we haven't really allocated at this point. I'm thinking particularly of, I'll say, North Temple and a catalytic project, which has nowhere near the money that's going to take to do a catalytic project there. That probably would be a housing specific. And so it's not that I'm opposed to doing citywide housing because I like the flexibility, but by doing project area housing, it sort of tied us into a policy perspective saying they should go into these areas. So I don't want that to drift too much in this discussion.
I think that's a great point, and let's note that as part of the goal. Okay.
Next major policy item is major infrastructure projects, and a lot of them were covered in the staff's walking through of the various project area budgets. And so I don't know if the chair wants to go through each of them and highlight sort of the status, or if you want to kind of, like you said before, put that to another day. I think much of this, sorry, didn't mean to interrupt.
Oh.
Much of this too would be informed by the bonding information, which we also don't have quite yet. And so it's possible that some of the conversation might, be shaped by that information.
Board members, my recommendation would be that unless you have a specific question, we maybe hold off till we have that bonding information, because so many of these things are potentially bond eligible. Are you all okay with that? So let's keep going for a bit. If you have a question on one of these things, or anything that has come up as you've read through this staff report, sing out.
Sorry, you're talking about 3A.
3A
1 and 2.
through D.
I'm sorry. Are you on page 6?
Yeah, page 6, 3A through 3D, and I realize that there's a sub-numbering in there that's probably confusing things, but
Yeah.
Continuing on to page 7, there's
Everything
infrastructure
about
projects.
infrastructure that goes through 3D, that's the Granary District infrastructure, is that right? Okay.
Yeah, I think that I wrote to Jennifer and Ben last night about I have some questions about the contingencies we've placed on the 9th South Street improvements. And I think Stan had something to do with those contingencies, and he's not here today, and we're going to postpone talking about that. But I just want to say that I hope that we can readdress that as a board, because I don't want to tie that project with a lead balloon. So, and I feel like some of the contingencies are, but I'll leave it at that for now.
Okay, if you want to talk more about it, we've got some time.
It's items, it's the
Right.
3A, 1 and 2A and B. So at 2C, it talks about the 9th South Street improvements. Let's wait for Stan to be here, and he
Okay.
can speak to those too.
All right.
And it's a little, I'm realizing it's a little difficult with the formatting, but the administration did provide a status of the project itself. And so if the board has any questions about those, just let us know and we'll get follow-up. Some of the updates are directly related to some of the questions that the board asked in the last board meeting.
And I did email that to the council last night when Laura got it to me.
Great.
Which, thank you, Laura, for getting us that.
Okay, any other questions on the infrastructure? We'll be back many times about this, I have a feeling. And I also just wanted to say that the approach that the general fund uses for the budget, where the operating budget's approved, and so the business of the city continues, and then capital projects are discussed sort of later in the year when the time and information can be available. And so that's sort of the CIP budget model, where you adopt the budget and the budget goes forward, and then you also adopt the CIP budget later in the year. So just for that. So there's some other project area requests that are just highlighted maybe just for board member consideration. The Utah Theater repayment of the revolving loan fund. This is more just flagged as an interesting sort of history. I think it was before most of the board members were on the board, but the revolving loan fund actually provided the funds for the RDA, the majority of the funds for the RDA to purchase the Utah Theater. And so the CBD has been paying back the revolving loan fund since, but there's no formal requirement or state law for that to happen, but it was just an interesting accommodation. The 500 West design study, the scope has been revised since Budget Amendment 3, and so the cost is a little bit lower than was requested in Budget Amendment 3. And from what I understand from RDA staff, this item and the next item would be considered more sort of urgent to decide on soon. The public market implementation study, I think you discussed earlier, so won't necessarily need to go into that.
I wanted to say something about that, unless somebody else has a comment on that. I think it's really important that we look closely at how that money is being spent for the 100,000. That seems like a lot of money to me for coming up with a scope and also looking at a management plan. And so I want to really look closely at that. And maybe I'm wrong, but it seems like we need that fleshed out a lot more.
Okay.
And I think when we get the feasibility study, that will probably give us some guidance as well.
Great. And then we also discussed the debt reserve for Block 70 a little bit, so unless there's other questions on that, we can skip that. And the RDA Capital Improvement Program, the administration has presented the RDA budget kind of similar to the general fund budget, where there's essentially a transfer to the Capital Improvement Program from the given project area, and then each project area has its own sort of CIP log. I think this year there are it's not that there's a ton of projects this year, they're more sort of specific funding for specific projects. But I could see in future years that the board might consider a host of projects the same way that the council considers a host of projects in CIP that are all, wonderful needs that the council sort of decides among. And then the RDA could be approached in a similar way. The key thing to remember about these funds is that they wouldn't necessarily drop to fund balance at the end of the year. So the intention is that these funds would carry forward into future years. So.
Thank you for making that clarification. That was a question I was going to ask. I think also that as we switch this a little bit to doing it more in a CIP type approach, that it's worth asking RDA staff, okay, if we have this much money, what will that buy us? And, can we have the deluxe edition for this price? And if we can only get the basic package, what will that cost? And, like I always want the tennis channel, but it's always in the deluxe package. Mm-hmm. So you have to decide if it's worth it or not. And I think we need to do that and make sure we're making good decisions, because pretty much everybody would like the deluxe package, but if we can't afford it, we can't have it. So let's make sure we're asking those kinds of questions. Okay, any questions additionally to that? Go ahead.
We're pretty much all done. That we've listed some policy questions that have appeared over the last few meetings we've had. Some of them have even been addressed by some of the policies that you've adopted, so we'll make that change in the next staff report, but just for your consideration. So we can talk about that another time. Mm-hmm.
Any additional questions? I would like to steer me in the right direction if I'm wrong on this, but I'd like to propose to the board that we have an RDA budget follow-up meeting, and we need to confirm this with the chair and the vice chair of the council, but to spend an hour or so on this on May 30th to have follow-up so that we'll be ready to adopt timely, and wondered if you are all comfortable with doing that, with the provision that the chair and vice chair of the council have to approve that. James?
Yeah, I'm comfortable with that. If you look at item number 5.2, property disposition proceeds policy, I think that's something that I would like to have a discussion with as well. When we sell property, I think why not discuss, sending it into one big account for affordable housing and use the proceeds that way so that we can continue further our affordable housing component. So I think that question needs to be brought up in the next meeting as well.
Okay.
We'll make a note of that.
Thank you.
And in the meantime, if any other questions come up when you read more information, feel free to send them to me or Ben, and we can follow up with the administration and get the answers prior to the next meeting.
I would like us to talk about 6C, which is that discussion around the consolidation of loan funds to the revolving loan fund. And I'm interested in this, and I'd love some feedback from the mayor, administration on maybe their vision of pros and cons of this approach.
Believe, and I need to check you guys recently adopted a policy on the revolving loan fund, and I don't know if it addressed this consolidation issue, so we'll have to double check it and see what it says.
Okay, yeah, let's check that out. Anything further? I would also just say that, you know, when we've had some of these meetings that have gone on and on and on and on, and you sit there and you think, these are hours I will never get back again in my life. Today's your day. You're getting some of it back. So if there are not further budget questions, we will move on in our agenda. Thank you so much, all of you, for briefing us. Do we have any thing from the executive director, David Litvak, to anything? And I jumped the gun in bringing up when we meet the meeting on May 30th. I guess that actually should have taken place under item 5, as report from the chair. Forgive me for that. And do we have anything from the staff? Need to know. Hey, just be ready to have us come back from Boston and from our urban exploration with things that we'll be wanting to take RDA money to spend, like we did last year. So we're ready for that. Then, if we don't have anything else, we miraculously are adjourned. And because this was agended to start at what time? At 2:30. We have a little break here. Okay. Thank you very much. We stand adjourned.